Hurricane Ida touched down in New Orleans yesterday, causing millions of people to be left stranded without power, without cell service, or access to emergency responders. Images of families standing on rooftops in hopes of being rescued as they attempted to escape from 12 feet of water and extreme flooding are reminding us of the 2005 horrific images from Hurricane Katrina. On the 16th anniversary of Katrina, which was the deadliest storm in U.S. history, we are asking, what is causing such extreme weather conditions and how are communities of color being impacted? All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Most people agree that climate change increases the frequency of extreme weather events. Weather extremes that used to be rare are becoming increasingly common events as the climate warms. Sadly, African Americans, the poor, and the elderly suffer the most from these climate changes. When Hurricane Harvey devastated Texas in 2017, the neighborhood that suffered the worst flood damage was a section of Southwest Houston where 49% of the residents are non-white. When Hurricane Katrina hit Southeast Louisiana in 2005, the damage was the most extensive in the region's African American neighborhoods. Of the 7 zip codes that suffered the costliest flood damage from Katrina, 4 of them had populations that were at least 75% Black. And today, Hurricane Ida is wreaking havoc on poor communities throughout New Orleans as residents beg to be rescued. These are many of the same communities devastated by Katrina. Protesters last summer decried climate-related issues and the disparate impact it has on Black communities, from economic loss, social disruption, and housing inequality. Have we learned any lessons from Katrina, and where do we go from here? Here for my leadoff discussion is Dr. Gregory Jenkins. He is a meteorologist and professor at Penn State in the Department of Meteorology. He has spent 2 years at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and he's a returning guest to the special report. Good morning and welcome back to the show, Dr. Jenkins.
Good morning.
Oh, Dr. Jenkins, when you were last here, we were talking about floods in Houston and extreme weather patterns there. And today we're looking at this just horrific Hurricane Ida. It feels like deja vu, though, to back to 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. Help us understand what the difference is in Ida versus Katrina.
Well, they were both what we call major hurricanes, but Ida, to me, was even more devastating because it moves so fast. Really, 2 days ago, it was down in Cuba, and yesterday afternoon, it was at the coast of Louisiana. So it moved very fast. The other part, similar to Katrina, but even, I guess, more devastating, was the rapid intensification. I mean, it went from basically a Category 1 to a near Category 5 in about 24 hours. And so those are unprecedented types of change, and the destruction factor is built in once we get to major hurricanes.
And I know from reports that New Orleans is better prepared, that they've invested billions of dollars after Katrina in their levee system in particular. And we're not seeing the level of breaking of levees as we saw with Katrina, but still we're seeing these horrific images of people who are stranded with no power, no cell service, inability to get access to emergency responders. Why, after 16 years, are these images, giving us this deja vu feeling as it related to Katrina? Have we learned anything from that costly and deadly storm that killed 1,800 people?
I feel as if when we get to major hurricanes, Cat 4s and 5s, I'm not sure how many cities or towns can handle the level of destruction with these types of storms. So you can learn something about preparation, but you can never really be prepared for a category 4 or 5 storm. Um, and the infrastructure is built, it's human infrastructure. No one is ready for, 15 inches of rain in a night or devastating winds. So, we're trying to manage, but I think as climate change continues to play out, sooner or later, we're going to have to ask the question of, should we even be in vulnerable zones like New Orleans, which is below sea level?
Yeah, and I guess Hurricane Laura hit Louisiana in 2020. So they've had back to back major hurricanes. Help us understand the impact that climate change is having on these extreme weather conditions and how they are causing them to be more extreme, more intense, as you just identified.
Well, the main thing is that the oceans are warming. So the Gulf of Mexico is very warm. Sometimes it's approaching 90 degrees. All of that warm water is the fuel that hurricanes really need. The other part is the environment is becoming more moist. So as the oceans warm, there's more evaporation and more water vapor available to dump out as rain. So the flooding that we've seen, whether it's New Orleans or Germany or Tennessee or North Carolina, we're witnessing this all over the globe. The real thing with the hurricanes are, though, you get like a 1-2 punch. You get the winds, you get the rain, you get the surge. And so it's all there, one shot deal. Not much you can do about it. And we're just at the beginning. So I study African easterly waves. We're looking at Africa. The waves are coming on very strongly. We're expecting the next 6 to 8 weeks to be pretty rough in terms of potential tropical cyclones.
And these changes that you say are happening at the Gulf of Mexico, is any of this being impacted by what we're doing? As humans, are we causing, this warming of the climate that's creating these extreme weather conditions?
That is a most definite true. The IPCC report was just released, and they clearly state, thousands of scientists all around the world, that humans are warming the earth at an unprecedented rate, more than any time over the last 2,000 years, and that's the last 100 generations. So we are in, as General Henri says, uncharted turf here for climate.
And help us understand, Professor Jenkins, what are we doing as humans? What activities are we engaged in that's creating the warming of the climate of the earth?
We're running our economies the best we can, and in the process, we're producing lots of greenhouse gases, and they have long lifetimes. They warm the system, and I think we're just seeing the beginning of it because, as the report shows, the ice in the polar regions, the ice sheets are going to come in later, and unfortunately for our kids and our grandkids and our great-greats, they are going to be dealing with something that we will never experience.
So when you say we're engaged in this conduct, naturally that the opposite of that means that we could be engaged in some other conduct, that this isn't, doesn't have to be this way. What are some of the things that we could do immediately to change the impact that our activity is having on these extreme weather conditions?
Well, right now, and all we can do is try to mitigate. I don't think we're going to be able to change it in the short term. In the long term, maybe we can reduce some of the impacts. But like sea level, we won't be able to stop it from rising. We can control the extent to which it rises, but it's already baked into the climate system. So if we come back 200 years from now, no matter what we do, there'll probably be 3 meters of sea level rise. And that's just, I guess, is unintended. We now know we just have to reduce the emissions. That's the bottom line. And then communities have to adapt. I don't think we can any longer keep this conversation of adaptation out of the conversation, whether it's urban environments like Chicago or Philly, or whether you're in a coastal zone like New Orleans or Wilmington, North Carolina. You have to just begin to adapt to the changing climate and the extremes.
And one thing we've seen, Professor Jenkins, with Katrina, now with Ida, is this extreme flooding and the disproportionate impact that this flooding has on communities of color. Help us understand, why are Black communities in particular so vulnerable to these weather conditions, particularly this extreme flooding?
Well, so much of this is historical in terms of how we even got here, and then looking at policies from last century, like redlining, where communities of color were put in. They were redlined. They were put in zones that flooded easily, places that just really don't have great coverage in terms of trees. They're warmer than normal. People don't have really the economic resources to rebound, and this is going to be a long-term problem. And so, you really hope that something could change. Hopefully, Biden, through this Justice 40, will help Black communities and brown communities deal with some of this. But I think we have a pretty difficult task ahead as it relates to extremes.
And one of the things that we're hearing in the news is that the hurricanes, obviously, as you said, just wreak havoc on communities, but the flooding is what causes most of the deaths that, we saw with Katrina, 1,800 people that died,
Yeah.
during that storm period. One person has been reported dead so far from Ida, although the governor of Louisiana said expect that number to rise and to rise, pretty quickly, as they are out now, just, rescue missions. Why is it that again, the flooding? Why is that so dangerous? When we hear about these storms.
Yeah, I mean, the flooding is coming fast. So the storms, whether it's a hurricane or typical thunderstorms now that are organized, they're dumping so much rain in a very short time. The landscape cannot handle it. Eventually, most of that water will get to rivers. So you'll see a secondary effect 2 or 3 days down the line as all this water starts to converge in river basins. And those downstream communities, even if it's not raining, may still be subject to lots of flooding. So, yeah, I mean, we're seeing this transition to flooding, extreme flooding, and that's the reality. We're seeing extreme heat, we're seeing extreme flooding, we're seeing extreme hurricanes. So the system is like being pumped up, like on steroids, or it's like someone putting their foot down on the gas. It's really pretty amazing to observe it. I mean, for me, Katrina was mind blowing to watch it, but to watch Ida develop so rapidly on Saturday, that was also very mind blowing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned, the heat waves, the fires, because again, African American communities aren't just being devastated by these storms and flooding. There was a study that said in California that during a heat wave, African Americans are twice as likely to die compared to other groups. Help us understand what's happening with other, things that are happening in the climate, from heat waves to fires, that impact Black communities in such a disproportionate way.
Yeah, I mean, the heat waves they're slower, so they're not like the flooding that we often see very fast. These heat waves develop over days or weeks, and they stay in place. And the heat waves are you have to look at like the material or the built environment, to look at the houses, to look at the ability to have air conditioning. All of these things come into play, and then how much you're out in the environment. But their heat waves are pretty devastating. I mean, they can kill hundreds of people over a few weeks, and most of the issues are tied to heat stress and heat exhaustion. It's on you. It doesn't cool off at night. It's hot during the day, and it's just creeping on people. And then it just has a this catastrophic impact on the human system, on the body.
Well, we know, Professor Jenkins, something as simple as having more trees in your community, trees that can provide more cover, is one way to address these heat waves. Why aren't we doing some of these simple things that could address the impact, particularly again on communities of color?
I mean, this is more of an adaptation strategy that we're going to have to move into. How do we protect ourselves from heat waves, from flooding in our neighborhoods? We're going to have to think about the structure that we live in. And for people who are buying a house, please pay attention to where you are in terms of the floodplain. And also if your area floods a lot. I mean, quite often, again, we don't know where we're moving to. It's just a beautiful house, but there might be a history to it. But for Black neighborhoods, there's often a history of areas being put, our neighborhoods being in low-lying areas that flood easily. And again, that ties back more to the historical racism that has occurred in this country over the last several hundred years.
Yeah, those flood areas, those urban heat islands, that have no tree cover, the pavement that's trapping more heat, and as you said, the low prevalence of air conditioning units in Black communities. Thank you so much, Professor Jenkins. Always a pleasure to sit down with you, helping us understand what's happening. Not a very bright picture you're painting there, but I guess I'm going to say I'm hopeful, although you say it's going to get worse.
For next 8 weeks, be ready. That's the only thing I can say is be prepared, be ready, have your kit in place and all your important documents. Be ready to move when the time comes.
Wow. All right. Got to leave it there. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Be safe out there. Thank you so much
Always.
again.
Thank you.
Okay. My next guest is Heather Toney. She was the first African-American and first female mayor of Greenville, Mississippi. She was also appointed by President Obama to serve as regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency Southeast Region. Currently, Heather is an environmental justice liaison for the Environmental Defense Fund, and joining her is Dr. Mustafa Ali. He's Vice President of Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization for the National Wildlife Federation, and together they are dynamic climate activists. Good morning, Heather, and good morning, Dr. Ali.
Good morning. So glad to be here.
That was some pretty depressing news from Professor Jenkins about what's coming, what's happening with the climate. And, he says, get ready, have your papers ready. That's kind of, a doomsday kind of prediction. What's going on, Heather? And why can't we get this together? Like, just plant some trees in some of these neighborhoods.
Well, literally, thanks so much. And Dr. Jenkins is right. First, everybody right now is trying to make sure that we're in a safe space. And in my heart, my prayers, my resources and thoughts go out to all of those along the Gulf Coast area that are currently impacted. But even myself, I'm sitting in Mississippi right now. My husband spent the weekend making sure we had a generator together. I did grocery shopping. This is what we do because this is quite literally the embodiment of Lord willing and the creek don't rise. If you've ever heard that statement, that is what is happening in terms of making sure that communities are prepared and that they are ready. And I have to say, we've learned a lot of lessons from Katrina. It was really good to see that the tabletop exercises that have been done over the past 16 years have yielded us making sure that there is awareness when there is a dangerous storm, that we respond, that we are ensuring that the infrastructure of our levees are strong, and that we're continuing to make sure that we can notify people in every single way possible how important it is to move out of the way of a dangerous storm. And I think Ida has shown that this has done well for us. Our communities are doing better in that respect. And I agree with Dr. Jenkins that this is clearly an indication that we have to support initiatives like Build Back Better, like Justice 40, so that we continue to see infrastructure built in the communities that are impacted first and are impacted worst. At the exact same time, we also have to reckon with the fact that we didn't include a pandemic in our tabletop. We did not reckon with the fact that we were going to have to escape and leave when we were in the middle of a very contagious disease that had no access. We have no access to hospital beds, no access to medical facilities in the middle of this pandemic, in the middle of this storm, and that we're in a space, the area that has been hit, that unfortunately, very unfortunately, has some of the lowest vaccine rates and mask requirements in this country. And so it adds an additional layer on top of what we need to do. And I'm so glad to be here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Ali, who together we've run these initiatives for quite some time. It shows that there's just so much more space to work in.
Heather, I hear you when you say we're so much, better prepared. And obviously, Katrina killed 1,800 people so far. Thankfully, only one person has been reported dead from Ida. But when I look at those images and see people, on top of roofs stranded and hear that there's no power, there's no cell. So that means people aren't eating. That means they have no access, to running water or to, lights. I'm asking, are we really that much better prepared? It doesn't, you've been a mayor of a city. I've watched the mayor of New Orleans, just talk about how devastating this storm has been on the residents of New Orleans. And I'm a little surprised that we're, not better able to, withstand a storm like Ida. Although, I heard Professor Jenkins say this stuff is just getting worse. These extreme weather conditions are getting worse. But are we really prepared?
Well, I have to say, and hats off to the mayor of New Orleans. You never want to lose a single life, let alone hundreds of thousands of lives. And so the ability to move swiftly throughout the community and send a message and save even one life is better than what we were before. And so to that degree, I think that there is a bit more that we have done in terms of, again, just being able to talk to one another and stress how important it is to lead. But there are some more areas where we do need to get more prepared, where we do have to see the things that we can't see right now. For example, this storm hit in the area of a number of petrochemical facilities that release emissions that are very dangerous to people who are living in and around any of these facilities. And so what happens is when everybody leaves, no one is there to monitor what is coming out, what carcinogens are in the air, and what is left in the spaces where people leave. We can't monitor that at this point. We don't know what those numbers are. That is a space where we were unprepared, but we cannot see, and it's very, very dangerous. So that's the example of things that I think of in terms of, yes, we're able to move people out. We are better prepared. We do not have as much loss of life. But at the same time, there are a number of different issues that have to do with how our climate is changing, how we are monitoring it, and how we are really assessing risks to know what's going to happen down the line. How do we get even better at this process? So this is not the end of the road, but I do, maybe it is because I'm from the South, I'm a former mayor. I do have a bit of hope that we are getting better and we're going to continue to learn from these lessons.
Jump in here, Dr. Ali. I don't want to beat up on the mayor of New Orleans because I can't even imagine, the kind of stress that she's under, the challenge. And we've watched her, handle COVID and so many other situations, with just such grace and dignity and competency. But again, I see these folks who are stranded, and we know that many of them are in poor communities, and we know that poor communities in New Orleans are going to be, bearing the brunt of this storm. Are we learning any lessons, particularly about how we help, poor people of color, weather these kinds of these hurricanes that we're seeing? 2020 it was large. 2021 it's Ida.
Well, my grandmother says that when you know better, do better. And we know that there is still significant disinvestment that is happening across the Gulf Coast and across our country when it comes to communities of color. We also know that, as been stated before, that these things are going to continue to get stronger and stronger and stronger. So there has to be intentionality in where we place resources. There have been billions of dollars that have been placed in New Orleans to change out pipes. And to begin to better utilize natural infrastructure, which we know can slow storm surges. But when you move outside of New Orleans, then it starts to get kind of sparse in places that people have been investing. And that's why I say there has to be real intentionality, because there are huge amounts of dollars that move, but our communities are often the ones who are forgotten or that we are disinvested in, or a limited amount of funds are coming. Let me just be very clear with folks also, is that racism has played a significant role in the impacts that we see. Professor Jenkins sort of set up the paradigm for you around redlining and restrictive covenants and these types of things. So we understand that people have been placed in sacrifice zones, then the disinvestment has happened, and then we see these impacts that continue to happen, but we have to broaden it out. Heather talked about also the COVID-19 situation that we find ourselves in. Well, we got 25 million people in our country who are dealing in medically underserved areas or in physician deserts. So when they are impacted by these storms or wildfires or heat events, it's more difficult for them to actually be able to get the medical services that they need. And there's an extraction of wealth that is also happening inside of our community. So we have to really take a holistic approach to what's going on, especially when we know for the first time ever that with both the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill, that we got a chance to really change some dynamics. But we can't forget the history that we come from, and how that has played a role in putting us in the position that we find ourselves in today.
So I'm glad you mentioned the bipartisan bill and the parallel bill that Biden is trying to push through, the Democrats through reconciliation. I want to bring into the conversation now Dr. Frances Colin. She is a senior director, international climate policy for the Center for American Progress. Good morning, Dr. Colin.
Thank you so much.
So all three of you, big brains around what's happening in our environment, climate change, and climate policy. So I really want to, help people understand. Let's start with this bipartisan infrastructure bill. We know that Biden has made a pretty big and bold commitment, and he says that this bill is going to benefit in significant ways African American communities. I know, Heather, you are out with an op-ed piece a little earlier, about a month ago, where you questioned some of the provisions included in the bipartisan bill. I think I read a quote from you, Dr. Ali, and I know, Dr. Colin, you think the bill doesn't go far enough. I'll start with you, Dr. Colin. Tell us what's in the bill, and then we'll talk about, what isn't there that should be there, particularly that's going to address some of these, disparities and the race issues that Dr. Ali just talked about so eloquently.
Absolutely. So I think the way we have to think about this is the bipartisan infrastructure bill really gets to the heart of building a more modern grid that will take electricity, energy to our communities. That is not enough, because what you need is to produce clean energy that will travel along this electrical grid to our communities. What does that do? That reduces pollution. That reduces our emissions, which are causing global warming. And so that is why everybody that is working on these issues from an equity perspective is focused on not only the bipartisan bill, which is good, but not enough, also on the reconciliation package, which actually includes the incentives to produce clean energy, and to make the investments in our communities that we need to reduce emissions and make them healthier and more resilient.
Well, again, when Biden talks about the bill, he says the bill was developed through a racial justice equity lens. He says, again, that it's going to substantially benefit African Americans, talks about billions being awarded in government contracts to minority companies. Black farmers are supposed to get guaranteed loan financing and grant funds from the bill. Talks about 10 million lead pipes that will be removed or replaced. And, the list kind of goes on and on, but the environmental justice folks are saying this isn't enough. Again, Dr. Ali, I want to understand, before we talk about what's not in the bill, is there anything in the bipartisan bill that you do think gets at the heart of some of the issues you've identified?
Well, I think it was mentioned, a third of the lead pipes being taken out is really important, because we remember what happened in Flint, Michigan, and there are 3,000 locations across our country that have higher levels of lead than Flint did. So that's really important. There's some dollars that are in there in relationship to wastewater treatment and some of the other things that we know are important. But, that particular bill does not really speak to the immediacy of the moment that we find ourselves in. And here, let me just be very clear with folks, because I led the interagency working group when I worked under the Obama administration. That's 17 federal agencies, a couple White House offices. I've advised a couple of White Houses. Here's the problem that we have in this moment, especially for Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. When we're talking about resources, leaving the feds and going to the states, the counties, and the local governments, one, the capacity is not there. Two, if you don't build real accountability where they have to actually direct these resources to the communities that need them the most, then those dollars are going to continue to flow, but they'll go to the usual suspects. So we have to be very clear in that. And many of us are pushing in the reconciliation bill to build real accountability. But we're working inside of a system that was never built to protect our communities. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke to us about that a long time ago. So that's why when I talk about intentionality, whether in the bipartisan bill or in the reconciliation bill, Black and Brown and Indigenous and lower wealth white communities and Asian Pacific Islanders have to be front and center. And there needs to be real accountability for the dollars that have to go there for all the items that we all know have to be a part of that if we're going to make communities whole.
So Heather, I'll ask you again, in terms of what's not in the bill. I know you feel like the bill doesn't go far enough, but can you identify, just 2 or 3 things in the bill? This is the bipartisan bill that you think, are getting at the heart of the issue, particularly around communities of color.
So, as Dr. Ali said, this is one of the things, and even Dr. Colon, it is very important that we have a bill, but addressing the actual issues that we need to address and being able to do that. So it was very disappointing to see so much research and development pulled out of the bill. A lot of people don't think that, okay, hey, that's a really important thing, when in reality it is, because it's talking about green dollars. It's talking about initiatives that we can develop right now, particularly within our HBCUs, that really put us to the next place of moving communities into the economic wealth that we know is going to come with this green movement and this green initiative. To see funding that's removed out of the bill, as Dr. Ali says, you have a third for water, but there was so much more that was there for water pipe replacement that has been taken out of the bill. And so these are all initiatives that we are working to ensure that through the reconciliation they're in place, but also it's about ensuring that there is access to be able to implement. And let me sort of share what that means, because I do come from the perspective of both working as a mayor, and I was there under ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and even as a regional administrator, when you have to take the dollars and put them to work in the community. And as both Dr. Ali and Dr. Colon have stated, it is very important for communities of color to be able to do this at this moment. This moment is so important for us because we're at the crux of the climate crisis, where we have to make some type of significant change, a bold action. And we're at a very special place where we have both houses of government and the White House. And that's not guaranteed for a long time. So in order to really make implementable change, we have to not only put the resources there, but remove the barriers of access for communities of color. And that happens on an administrative space. It happens in a legislative space, which is this bill, and through reconciliation. And last but certainly not least, down in our communities, our mayors, our city council members, our firemen, school board members, church officials, people who are actually going to take and put it to work so that the folks who are living every single day can actually see the action take place and know that it's working. That's why this is so important, and why we really have to continue to press in this reconciliation bill.
And I'll go back to you, Dr. Ali. You mentioned so that these funds don't end up with the usual suspects. First of all, identify for us who those usual suspects are, and then what's going to be different in the reconciliation bill? What's going to prevent those dollars from going to, these people that you identify as the usual suspects?
Well, let's put this into context. We give about $20 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry, even though we know that they are the ones that are playing a role in the warming up of our oceans and our planets. So you can't continue to do that. If you're going to break the addiction to fossil fuels, then you have to break the addiction, and we have to move forward on a just transition. So is
the fossil fuel industry, is that the usual suspects that you're talking about?
They're a part of it, but also, so we mentioned contracting and subcontracting. When you go and look at the amount of dollars that go to African Americans or Latinx-led organizations, entities, businesses, it is minuscule compared to the resources that go. So let's go back to Hurricane Katrina or the BP oil spill, things that I worked on. So when you looked at the BP oil spill, the contracting and subcontracting opportunities, they didn't go to Black-owned businesses. They didn't go to Latinx-owned businesses. They didn't go to Indigenous-owned businesses. The subcontracting, that did not in any significant way go to those folks either. The dirtiest jobs actually went to folks who were actually cleaning up. So we have to continue to evolve and make sure that folks understand that when these dollars are moving, we've got to make sure that they're going to Black and brown and Indigenous businesses, or we don't change the wealth gap.
But what I'm trying to ask you, Dr. Ali, is I thought you made a statement that the reconciliation bill is better equipped to do that, to be intentional and to make sure those dollars get there to the people they're intended for. And I'm just trying to understand, what's the difference? Whether it comes through the bipartisan bill or the reconciliation bill, where is the accountability going to come from? because I don't see necessarily that the dollars coming from reconciliation are going to end up in the intended hands any more so than the dollars from the bipartisan bill.
So I'll follow you on that, and let me be clear. The reconciliation bill gives us a new suite of opportunities, everything from EVs to charging stations to the new additional things that happen around the electrical grid. All that being said, we have these new sets of opportunities, but there still has to be that accountability that folks have to build into it. And that's where it gets tricky that nobody wants to talk about, because the vehicles that move the money in many instances have its own set of requirements that have been put in place by law and policy that we also have to work on. And we usually don't talk about that enough to help people to understand and to also make sure that people's expectations, that they're clear on the challenges that are going to move forward. So I know whether it's on the Justice 40 side of the equation or a number of other folks who are working and trying to figure out how do we do this in a way that's going to be equitable? And then how do we hold people accountable also as the dollars move? And that's the challenge.
Yeah, and that's what's frustrating about this, Dr. Ali, because even with the eviction moratorium and all the billions of dollars that have been set aside to prevent people from being evicted, you know, we hear these horrific stories of people being put out of their apartments, their homes, because they can't access the money. Not because the money hasn't been allocated, but because it's not making its way, it's not trickling down to the people who actually, you know, need it. So, Dr. Colon, I guess I'm not all that satisfied that this is a distinction that's making a distinction that you know, where are we, how do we ever get to a solution with this if the accountability, you know, isn't there, if we have billions of dollars that have been set aside, you know, whether it's for, you know, reduction of you know, lead pipes or addressing fossil fuel in this country, but the money doesn't get into the hands of the people that can, you know, make a change. You know, is there anything in either of these bills that gives you any hope that there is some accountability that's going to make a difference?
What gives me hope is that there has been a commitment to have a whole of government approach on this, right? So the money flows to a government agency, whether it's the EPA or Health and Human Services, and they dole out money downstream, like Dr. Ali said. What needs to happen is that the criteria for how that money moves, who it goes to, removing barriers. If you are an organization that's been an advocate for climate justice, like where I live here in South Florida, where sea level rise and hurricanes are everyday topics of conversation, the ability for those organizations to be able to implement the work where it matters, where vulnerable communities are, those barriers to those organizations, those groups, the groups that actually know what the need is, need to be removed. A lot of times those groups aren't eligible for the funding. A lot of times the money flows, like Ali said, to the usual suspects because these have been years and years of procurement rules that have gotten in the way of us being able to implement. We need 40% of that investment to move into our communities. And to do that, we need to develop those criteria and standards and remove those barriers.
Let me ask you, Heather, about the Green New Deal. So, you know, we've been talking about the bipartisan infrastructure deal. We talked about the reconciliation bill. But, you know, there's also a lot of talk about the Green New Deal. Sometimes it gets a lot of bad press because of, you know, just how the progressives that have gotten behind it are painted in the media. But help us understand, is the Green New Deal the solution to some of these problems that we're talking about?
I think the issue is not necessarily what is the name of the program, but what are the items that are in the package that actually get us to where we need to be. And part of that has been the problem. So many people have gotten up and politicized the words Green New Deal, that we no longer are looking at as what is within these packages that need us, that help us meet this goal of getting to net zero or carbon neutral by the time the IPCC says we need to get there. And so I think let's go back to how this conversation even started. We know that climate change, the climate crisis, is impacting communities of color and marginalized communities first and worst. We also know that according to the IPCC, we now have to move to risk management and resiliency, as well as reducing our emissions in two specific places, CO2 and methane. That is human interaction. So that's getting us to reduce our usage of fossil fuels, getting us to a place where we're not putting as many emissions in there. And at the same time, being able to create resiliency efforts to protect communities that are really on the front line of the climate crisis, whether it's through hurricanes, wildfires, all of these things have to happen in order for us to exist. So if we look at programs that are within the Green New Deal, if we are looking at programs that are within communities, if we're looking at the actual measures and path to get us there, it doesn't make a difference what it's called. It's the fact that we actually have to get the work done. And that's where I think a lot of us are sitting, because we're looking at these numbers, we're looking at what all of the global experts are telling us absolutely must be done. To put a label on it is one thing, but getting the work done, stopping the usage and reducing fossil fuels, getting us to a place of access to the funds that we need and building resilient communities, that's the point. And we can call it whatever we want to call it.
And Dr. Ali, help us understand, assuming this reconciliation bill makes its way, through the House and through the Senate, gets, signed off by Biden. What are two of the most immediate things that we're going to see coming out of that bill that are going to have an impact?
Well, I think you're going to see a set of rapid actions moving us more toward electric vehicles and efficiency and housing across our country, which will have huge benefits for vulnerable communities who are often living paycheck to paycheck. So lowering people's electricity costs, I think, will be another one. We'll finally get the majority of the pipes switched out because there's additional dollars that are inside the reconciliation bill to get rid of lead pipes. We got about 10 million to 12 million pipes across our country, so we'll finally be able to get to that. And then hopefully we'll get significant resources that are also going to make it to frontline organizations. But I don't stop there, because that's the reason I talk about intentionality and accountability, because just because a percentage is going there, I want to see, when we say Justice 40, I really want to see 40% of resources making it to communities. And right now we're operating from a paradigm of 40% of benefits, which is important also. But real dollars, people can leverage those to be able to do additional things. So I'm excited that for the first time ever, we're going to have real resources moving in this direction if we can make sure that Senator Manchin and Sinema support the bill. But we've got to stay on it, and we've got to then engage with folks on the state houses and in our county commissions, in our local governments, to make sure that our voices are holding them accountable and letting them know these are the things that we have got to have.
And just finally, for you, Dr. Colon, assuming that the bill doesn't make it, I mean, there's no guarantee that this bill is going to make it. Where do we go from here?
It would be a real tragedy, because this is the most historic investment in climate change that we're set to make in our country. And it is our presentation card to the international climate change negotiations. We said we're back in the Paris Agreement. We need this bill to pass to show up there and show up well, presenting our country and with the changes that we're going to make domestically. If this doesn't pass, then we'll be relegated to a bunch of executive orders, much like what happened during the Obama years, to help regulate emissions from vehicles, et cetera. And honestly, because of the rate of change that we need to implement right now, because of the climate impacts that we're facing, and because of what science has told us, we don't have time for incremental, tiny changes. We need whole-scale change across our economy, whole-scale change that is just, that produces jobs, that lowers our emission and reduces pollution in our communities. And we need this bill to really accomplish those goals.
Well, as they say, watch this space. Obviously, lots going to happen over the next couple of weeks, and hopefully we'll be celebrating the passage of both of the infrastructure bill and the bipartisan bill. Thank you so much, Heather, Dr. Ali, Dr. Colon, for helping us understand, pretty complicated stuff that's happening, particularly around climate and around these two vital pieces of legislation. I appreciate all the work that all of you are doing to lift up communities of color and to make communities of color a priority as we talk about climate change. Again, thanks for sitting down with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, my next guest is Tara Houska. She is a tribal attorney and climate activist whose work is around environmental justice issues for Indigenous people. Good morning and welcome, Tara.
Good morning.
Tara, you were quoted as saying, "We are not going to solar panel our way out of environmental disaster." What did you mean by that?
Exactly what I said. I do not see a situation in which simply replacing one form of extractive energy with another is going to address the climate crisis in the time that we need it to happen. While all of these incremental changes are happening and bills are being proposed that don't pass, and these promises to go to net zero in like 10, 20 years, 30 years or whatever, electric vehicles and all of those things are very important. But in the meantime, the continuation of extraction and destruction is happening in the last beautiful places in the world. I'm sitting in one of them right now. Indigenous peoples are 5% of the population globally. We hold 80% of its biodiversity. Yet we're the ones that are oftentimes missing from almost all these discussions. And we're the ones that are on the front lines of fighting what's happening in real time while the politicians are talking.
Are you encouraged at all by either of the bill that we were just talking, had a lengthy discussion about the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill? Are you encouraged about, any of the provisions within either of those bills?
I'm encouraged by the fact that human beings are becoming more aware of just how deep into the climate crisis we really are, that large scale, bill proposals are being made and being heard. However, as I said, in real time, I'm sitting at the front lines of the largest tar sands infrastructure project in North America that is almost 90% complete. And there's been 800 people arrested during the course of resisting this particular project. It is happening. And I don't believe that engaging only in those comfortable forms of advocacy and the comfortable, centering of human comfort is the route that we're going to save ourselves from destruction.
What do you think? Everyday people that are listening to this who, care about the environment, care about, what's happening around climate change. What do you advise them to do?
It would be really powerful to see a value shift happen among particularly westernized society, so-called westernized society, where, I think our entire way of life is based on extraction and consumption from other places. These things that we don't really think about, and a way of life that is so destructive. To see a value shift of centering our relationship with nature, which is where we come from. People are very disconnected from that basic truth of we can't live without clean water, clean soil, and clean air. We can't do those things as human beings. Like, we need them. And no matter how we can convince ourselves that we're buying our water out of a bottle and it's always there and it's always going to be there, I'm coming from one of the places that water comes from. And this water is being contaminated also by new tar sands infrastructure projects, by new fracked oil, new fracked gas, new copper panels that folks are referencing. It is deeply powerful to see people reshaping and reframing their way of life and pushing back against the accepted way of life, which is just, I'm going to work my 9 to 5 and I'm going to barely make ends meet. Maybe I'm going to work 2 9 to 5s actually, or something like that, work multiple jobs and be stuck in these cycles of abuse to the earth and abuse to ourselves too, and seeing that shift happen, that value shift happen, I think often leads to people wondering, what can I really do with my body and with my agency? And I've seen that happen many, many times over the course of the last 2 years of fighting this project. But it's been a 7-year fight, right? We fought in the regulatory system, the political system, the legislative system, the court system, every single avenue that people are most familiar with. And then we were putting our bodies on the line. And that is how we actually got national attention. That's how we got the president involved. That's how we got the Army Corps of Engineers out here consulting finally towards the end, was human beings risking their bodies and their freedom.
Mm-hmm. But for those folks who are not going to, join in that kind of protest, who are not going to march, what can they do in their just everyday lives to better respect the planet? As you just said, respect that we can't live without clean air, and water? What are just some simple things that people can do?
I mean, I've seen the especially over the time of the pandemic, where Mother Nature told the world that she can shut us down at any moment, and she did. I mean, there was, I think, a collective understanding of where does my food come from? Where does my water come from? And those lines that we saw outside of food shelves and outside of spaces where people were, I have no access to any of these things. There was a huge uptick in like community gardens. There's a huge uptick in people learning how to grow their own food and people thinking about where does my water come from? Those things are something that I hope are lessons that stay with us, that we remember, that just going and buying it at the grocery store when that piece of that vegetable or whatever it happens to be is probably from thousands of miles away, picked by people who are underpaid, understaffed, underrespected, versus the work to actually do that yourself. There's a lot of movement towards that and towards creating more urban green spaces and all of that. I think there's also an understanding that the rural folks in this conversation, the people that are out on the land, we have a lot to share. And that seems to be kind of like one of those missteps that happened with the Green New Deal, is like it was kind of marketed as this progressive type effort, which it is. But it also encompassed a lot of those working class folks. And that kind of got left out, even though it is part of the Green New Deal. That the people who are growing food, the people who are out, providing these so-called natural resources to the rest of the world, need to have a transition also. So we aren't just provided jobs that we need to extract to live, and we need to be the sacrifice zones for everyone else. That isn't climate justice.
Yeah, I know you've spent 6 months, Tara, in North Dakota fighting the pipeline. Are you feeling encouraged by having the Biden administration in office? Do you think that they understand, what the issues are, and that there's a real commitment there to make, substantial change?
If the Biden administration was going to follow through on its promises, I wouldn't be fighting this pipeline that I am right now. It would have been suspended, and there would have been a full environmental impact statement ordered, which was the same thing that was asked for in the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle. They asked Obama to issue a full environmental impact statement and do a full review, because there's no way that project or this one would pass any sort of climate test. There's no way that it would have passed any sort of cultural resources, tribal cultural resources analysis. But instead, the Biden administration is following the playbook right out of Dakota Access. The Army Corps of Engineers is actually pushing to not include an assessment of climate, to not include an assessment of tribal cultural resources. We are being treated like sacrifice zones again in the face of climate crisis. And it's a hugely disappointing, and I think it's pretty hypocritical to position yourself as a climate presidency, to position yourself as respectful of Indigenous sovereignty, to have folks out there talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women. Yet there are multiple sex trafficking rings that have been busted here, where I'm calling from, of Enbridge employees who are out building this destructive project through our territory and hurting our people at the same time.
And I know, Tara, that you say we need to decolonize our perspective. Help us understand what you mean by that.
Decolonization is a lifelong process, and it's one that is deeply introspective, and it's centering those truths that I spoke about, centering the truths of what we need as human beings to live. We need each other. We need clean soil, clean air, and clean water. Those are really simple truths that are oftentimes absent from our understanding of our relationship to the world around us, to society around us. Decolonizing is not a symbolic action. It's a real one, steeped in deep values and truth about where we're at as human beings. I mean, we're in rough shape. Where I'm calling from, where they're building this project, we are in extreme drought. This is northern Minnesota. This is the start of the Mississippi River. This is the start of, we're right next to Lake Superior, one of the biggest freshwater lakes in the world. And what happened in this project in the construction is the Minnesota DNR approved a 5 billion gallon extraction of water to build this pipeline in extreme drought. So you got rivers that are already puddles and a tar sands company from Canada extracting the water that's left to build a tar sands pipeline underneath of them, to bore under 22 rivers, to bore under 800 wetlands and 200 bodies of water. That is watching our own self-destruction in real time, and being confronted with that, and also seeing hundreds and hundreds of young people, mostly young people, chaining themselves to the machines, crawling into pipes, standing in front of these excavators that are digging up the rivers. That is a lesson as humanity that I don't think we should take lightly. This isn't just about protests and about, trying to, make our voices heard. It's about changing the way that we think and the way that we live with the world around us.
How long will you be out there, Tara? Any plans of, what are the plans for you as it relates to the work that you're doing in this northern Minnesota area?
I've been involved in the Line 3 fight for 7 years. I've been living on the land for the last 3 years, out here 200 yards off the proposed Line 3 route, and have been honored to spend time with literally at this point thousands of people who have come through and sought a different way. They've done the petitions, they've done the marches, they've done the rallies, they've clicked the little change.org thing and tried to make their voices heard, and it didn't work. And so there's a lot of people from all walks of life that are finding their way to frontline struggle, that are finding their way to this beautiful resistance and this stand for life. And we want to look back and see in this critical moment, what did we do? What were our actions? What did we risk? And what did we walk? How did we walk in all this talk that's happening? How did we actually walk? I think the plans are at this point it is wild ricing season. Wild rice is the tribal cultural resource, so-called resource. It's a sacred being that we're here to protect. That's why I've risked myself multiple times at this point, been shot at by rubber bullets, been shot at with mace and all that, and seen pain compliance used on water protectors, torturing people by police officers who are being reimbursed by Enbridge. So there's a direct financial connection between the industry and the law enforcement, local law enforcement. And so it's harvesting season. It's time for us to be out on the land and think about what we're actually here to protect and why we are doing these critical actions in these moments in this time.
Just finally, Tara, where can people who are interested in this, interested in the work that you're doing, interested in this project, where can they get credible, reliable information about what's happening where you are?
Yeah, sure. You can follow our work here from GNU Collective at GINIW Collective. You can also check out the larger, the overall kind of there's updates and how to plug in on stopline3.org. Those are both great resources to figure out your own place. And also, think about the decolonization part. That's real work and it's long work. But it's beautiful work and it's powerful work towards reconnecting ourselves with nature and reconnecting ourselves to ourselves. We're surrounded by nature all the time. I think that's something that I've encountered with dealing with a banking executive. So when we're out engaging in divestment and trying to say you're funding the project that's destroying our land, it's a banker in a 3-piece suit who's sitting there in some really high rise, bougie type space. And they feel so disconnected, right? They've got manufactured air and all that on them. And I'll always take a moment to say, you're surrounded by nature all the time. This steel is made out of elements of the earth. The glass is made out of manipulated sand. The clothes that you're wearing are made out of manipulated fibers. And there's always kind of this moment where people are looking at themselves. And I'm you are nature. You are surrounded by her. Also remember that and think about that.
Wow, it's pretty powerful. We've got to end on that. But thank you so much, Tara, for the work that you're doing. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your voice. I will definitely make sure people have access to your stopline3.com so they can get more information and figure out how they can get more involved. But again, thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Wow, Tara said something really powerful. She's, we are nature and we're surrounded by nature all the time. And although you may not decide that you want to get involved at the level of protest or joining a march or even writing to your legislators, she talked about some very simple things that we all can do and just recognizing that, clean air and clean water is vital to all of our existence. So, time, I think, for all of us to reflect and pause on what we're doing. And we heard Professor Jenkins in the beginning of the show talk about how it's our human activity. Some of this is happening naturally, but some of what's happening around climate change and these extreme weather conditions that we're witnessing is happening because of our own actions. So, if we want to see a different result, that means we have to do things differently. We can't, continue to do the things that we do and expect a different result. They say that's the classic definition of insanity is to keep doing the same things and wonder why you get the same results. So lots of great information shared today. Again, hearts and my prayers go out to those families that are in Louisiana and Mississippi who are suffering, the devastation from Hurricane Ida. Let's continue to keep them in our prayers and hope that those horrific photographs that we're watching on television, on the internet, that it's not in vain, that the investments that were talked about today are made into those communities, and particularly in those communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by these weather conditions. Just some words to live by before I get out. We all have an opportunity to eliminate historic and systemic racial inequities caused by climate change and discriminatory climate policies. By doing so, we will give marginalized people a chance at healthier lives and greater financial stability. Let's not blow this. We owe it to ourselves, and most importantly, we owe it to our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. They are all counting on us. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Wear your mask, and don't forget, we are all in this together.